It's my pleasure to be a conference, for the best practice. I will probably try to share some of my experience, but we have 3 speakers on fundraising best practice, and we have 65 minutes. I would ask that everybody talks between 12 and 15 minutes, and then we open, for Q&A. Ladies first or gents first?
Go with it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, Susan.
Hi, my name is Susan Walton. I think a number of you have already heard me introduce myself with respect to this institution, CERGE-EI, in which I serve on the board of the U.S. Foundation that supports it and the Teaching Fellows Program, Free Market Missionaries Program. I spent my career in the City of London, so I was a banker for many, many years, banking and broking, and I ran big research departments globally in the emerging markets is what I did. So you're going to hear today, it's a conversation amongst the 3 of us, and the 3 of us actually know each other all very well. You're going to hear from a former banker, a former lawyer, and Nicole also ran think tanks, and she's a professional fundraiser as well. So Nicole Conchar, which I think all you guys know very well. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background on, that's my way of thinking, is very much finance driven, and that's how I look at fundraising from a finance and corporate structure perspective. Graham will introduce himself, but he's very much involved in new business models and new structures for sustainability and arts funding. And Nicole has done fundraising and development for many, many different types of institutions, from think tanks through to arts, through to other types of social enterprises and charities and foundations. Right now, I sit on a number of charitable boards and advisory boards. They are focused around the arts and theater. They're also around think tanks and digital media as well. So it sort of runs the gamut. Right. So we're gonna talk to a few slides here, but the goal of this is that we can all have sort of a chat together. What I'm going to talk about is the area that I'm strongest in, is the business models or the corporate structures around nonprofits, think tanks, etc. And I want to get everybody thinking about the context of you're actually running a business. But the business has slightly different structures, and maybe some of you are charities, some of you could be nonprofits, and I'm just going to whiz through them very quickly, because how you fund them and different ways of funding them certainly is driven in many cases by your structure. So we all know about charities. I have, and our group is interesting here because we each probably have a slightly different view about charities. I think they're fine. I think they serve a purpose. But I also think, the structure of a charity is basically you're getting punished for earning and making a profit and keeping your own money. But that's my view. So the good thing about a charity that it attracts philanthropic capital via corporate and individual tax incentives, and that's a great thing, especially in the United States where it's almost an industry. In the UK, it's also very attractive too. They give you great tax breaks. It attracts government support, and that's either directly a government supporting, or a charity may fulfill a government program, but at the end of the day, you end up being employed by the state. There's a negative impact on control and the ability to scale. So your funders often will say, well, listen, I'm only going to put 10 or 20% to overheads. I've been in many circumstances, and I'm sure Graham and Nicole have had this, where there's complaints about how much you pay staff. I mean, I think if you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. And as a result of all of that, you end up having a lot of small charities there, and if you put them all together, it's a repeating of many, many overheads, huge inefficiencies, and that's a big issue. You can't accrue or realize the value in the corporate structure of a charity, so there's an asset lock. So certainly in the UK, and it will be different in different jurisdictions, so I don't know the law in all of them. In the UK, you can do an asset transfer between charities, but you can't actually sell a charity, so there's an asset lock. And as I say, you're structurally discouraged or punished for actually making money. And maybe that's a strong way to put it, but it's how I see it. Now, nonprofits are a form of a company, and the shares are limited by guarantee, so the shareholders are basically kind of trustees of those shares, and they manage those shares, but it's not a commercial enterprise and has the same characteristic as charities, but unfortunately it has no donor tax incentives or very limited tax incentives. Again, that will be driven differently by your jurisdiction. Now we move on to social enterprises, and this is one of my favorite models, and I think we have difference of opinion here too, which is interesting. A social enterprise has no real legal distinction in law, and it's treated legally as a normal commercial enterprise. That's legally. It attracts commercial capital, and it attracts also philanthropic capital. It's mission-led versus shareholder-led, so it attracts impact investors. It potentially lowers your cost of capital. You also could potentially have, below market returns, and there's no asset lock, and there you can actually have a commercial exit around that. So I'm a big fan of commercial enterprise because it mixes both kind of a commercial, but because it is mission-led, your investors know and they realize that they're investing in something that is first going to serve the mission, and second, it serves the shareholder. So they're not typically looking for commercial returns. They're looking for impact. And impact investing, which gets thrown around a lot, it's a spectrum. And some impact investors expect absolutely 100% impact, no return whatsoever. You get people that want to look at returnable grants, so they want a return with maybe a small percentage rate. Again, it's not totally commercial. You can look for people who are looking for profit-capped companies, the same sort of thing, and all the way to the spectrum where you get it thrown around a lot. It's beginning to change where you have commercial, like BlackRock, they think it's impact investing because they've invested in windmills in the Ukraine, right? Well, that's not, because they're looking for absolutely commercial returns. So it's really mixing, it's putting the shareholders first and not actually the mission first. And then you come to the other end of the spectrum, and that's a commercial enterprise, and that's run for the benefit of the shareholders. It is a standard commercial exit, and it attracts philanthropic capital too. This is something that a lot of people don't understand, is that you could actually give a gift of money to Microsoft. It could be a charitable gift. You don't get the tax benefit, but Microsoft can actually engage in a charitable activity. So as a think tank, for example, and you might be a nonprofit, therefore you don't get you're not able to give a tax break. You can still take charitable funds because you can ring fence that money for a charitable activity. So even a commercial enterprise, a for-profit institution, can do the same thing if they have a public good or a charitable activity. And usually you wrap some nice governance around that so that there's somebody on the board or two people on the board or a committee that's responsible for stewarding those monies. Right. I'm going to talk a little bit about the fundraising models, and these are Nicole's a specialty in this, and so is Graham from two different areas. And the first one that I'm going to introduce is the ask. You've got an ask possibility and you've got an earn possibility, and the ask possibility, which we're all familiar with and is super important, are gifts. So you have individual support and membership, small gifts. You have private philanthropy. You have trust and foundations. You have government sponsorship, and you have government grants and support. That's broadly how it works. And I'm going to pass this over to Graham, who is going to introduce himself. I just realized I didn't let you do that, so I'm sorry. You're going to introduce yourself, and maybe you can talk to this.
Sure. Yes, I'm Graham Henderson. I used to be a lawyer, but I've been working for a number of years now as a cultural entrepreneur, starting one arts organisation, growing it to a national brand, and now I'm running another organisation, which I've also started myself, which is mainly dedicated to exploring new business models for the arts, new ways to get money into the arts, new ways to get investment into the arts. So the subject of this panel discussion is very close to my heart. I thought it might be useful. I actually agreed with everything you said, so that's good. And I've got no disagreement with what you said about charities either. From my point of view, the only interesting thing about charitable status is the tax umbrella that it gives the arts, allowing the arts to perform. But actually, my main interest is in making the arts more enterprising and more business-like. I thought it might be helpful if I give you a brief review of where I see arts funding. This is obviously going to be from a UK perspective, although I think some of you will recognise from your own countries similarities. Government grants and subsidies have played a very important part in the arts sector in the UK, and in some other countries an even bigger part, I understand. It's still a dominant player in the UK, but generally speaking, I think its effects are very negative. It has induced a culture of subsidy dependence amongst arts organisations, and a sort of hand-to-mouth existence where even those who've diversified their funding model quite successfully, if they lose that core element of government funding, they don't know what to do with themselves. And you see arts organisations, close overnight because they lose their government funding. From my point of view, the main damage is psychological, if you like, because the government funding is attached. There's lots of conditions, and they're almost entirely uncommercial in nature. You're not allowed to make a profit. You're not allowed to borrow money. If you make a surplus, you're supposed to spend it all on that project. You're not allowed to build up surpluses. Success is punished, actually, and arts organisations, as a result, and all that funding is restricted as well. So you have to spend it on exactly the thing you've got it for. So there's no opportunity to do what any business would want to do, and invest in success. Take things which are going really well and scale them up and replicate them. You have to just move on, ask for more money, and they even punish you if you ask for money for the same thing twice. So you have to keep distorting the agenda of your arts organisation in order to guarantee the flow of state funding. So it discourages, to me, business-like practices, and ever since I've been working in the arts, I've been trying to break that sort of stranglehold.
It's not very enterprising, is it?
No, it's not. It's not at all. Enterprising. That model is also breaking down. Government funding has gone down by central government funding has gone down by 30% since 2008 in the UK. Local government funding for the arts has collapsed. So actually, it's a very shrinking iceberg. So arts organisations are unable, even if they want to depend on that source. Trusts and foundations I should touch on as well. They play a very important part in the market. To some extent, they share some of the same problems. It's project funding, it's restricted funding, there are conditions attached to a lot of grants, and often profit is not allowed as part of a model. It's also in decline because it's also gone down, I think, by about 30% since 2008, and more arts organisations are fishing in the same ponds for the same money. So that's also a bad news story. I incidentally have worked with, I've been enjoyed government grants, played an important part in launching my first organisation, and so has trust and foundation funding. I've worked with people like the Calouste-Gulbenkian and Wellcome Trust on large projects, so I'm familiar with the way those things work. Corporate sponsorship is a more cheerful story, and is obviously quite common in the more business-orientated economies. I think it's generally against the stereotype. I've always found it a very liberating form of funding. There's a lot of pushback against in the arts. So, people accuse you of being a sellout if you get sponsored by a big company. I have never experienced that. Big companies generally want you to, they don't care what you do as long as it's really high quality, and as long as you can find a mutual area of interest in terms of what you're doing and what they want to do in terms of entertaining clients, raising their profile, or whatever. I've never found them scared of controversial work, difficult work. So actually, from my perspective, corporate funding's been really a great thing. And I've worked with some of the big corporate brands. HSBC was one of my major sponsors, Lloyd's of London, the insurance market, Pfizer Pharmaceuticals, Lloyd's TSB Bank, and Pernod Ricard, all have been generous sponsors of my organisation at one time or another. There is a slight curse attached to corporate sponsorship, which I call the curse of the intermediaries. Increasingly, big corporates are working through consultants who interpose themselves between you and the sponsor and have their own agendas, and that's tending to distort the nature of the work in a different way and actually render it a little bit less interesting and exciting and contemporary.
Are those consultants the ones that are like looking to measure social outcomes and that sort of thing?
In some cases, yes. But I think they exist as consultants to de-risk the whole proposition for the sponsor. And I think, generally speaking, it does kill a lot of really interesting projects because their agenda begins to really dilute what you're trying to do. But generally speaking, corporate sponsorship has been, I think, a very good thing. But it's also down. It's also down by a significant percentage since 2008. So it's no longer as easy as it was.
One question, how are you able to get in the door with these corporate foundations? Because I know from a think tank perspective, it's quite difficult to get that first meeting. Do you find them friendly, or is it?
Well, anybody who knows me knows that I go around schmoozing people all the time. So most things have come from meeting people.
So perseverance.
Perseverance, networking. I'm a great believer in that. I think the intermediaries are a problem because increasingly you'll speak to somebody from HSBC or whatever, and they'll say, "Yeah, sounds great. Speak to our intermediary," and that's they're basically delegating, the sort of intelligence in a picking arts-related sponsorships, and I think that's a shame. It just removes the creative originality out of some of these sponsorships and makes them more look more the same. The final thing I was going to sort of talk about in this brief segment is private philanthropy, which you've already touched on, which is obviously been around for a long time and plays a very important part in the arts, and up to a quarter of the income I've had from my organisations have come from that source in any given year, especially if you've got good access to high net worth individuals, or you have individual supporters who love what you do. I think private philanthropy tends to favour the big arts brands. Not many philanthropists are actively interested in small and medium-sized organisations. And from my point of view, those are the organisations where some of the most interesting, original, enterprising work is being done. But obviously, private philanthropists often go for, a national ballet company or a national theatre or something that they really identify with as a top brand already. I think, however, private philanthropy is only a partial solution. I've tried running friend schemes for years. They're really difficult to monetize successfully. Also, crowdfunding is talked of a lot. I think it's still not quite there yet. I think the future is crowdfunding, but I know most of the crowdfunding experiments I've experienced, people have to cheat to get across the finish line. They have to get some of their leading donors to chip in so that the thing is a PR success. I think that's the way the arts are going. But I think it's not yet a solution for most arts organisations. Oddly, the one exception I'd say is legacy schemes are incredibly good, and so many arts organisations don't use them yet. But on average, they pay back within 2 years, which is an extraordinary statistic. And I can name several arts organisations who have been transformed by legacy gifts. The Poetry Society of America, for example, was an extremely impoverished national organisation, and it received the entire estate of a wealthy individual and has been transformed in what it can do.
I should mention, I used to work at the Foundation for Economic Education, which you mentioned yesterday. Yes. And I was there when Dawn Boudreau and we were turning the organization around, and we had very few donors. We were trying to rebuild our donor base. But boy, did we love the mail. We would open up the mail and we would get entire estates where Leonard Read had built these relationships with people in the 1960s. They had since fallen off the database, had lost the entire relationship, but they never changed their will. And it was transformational in turning feedback
Actually,
around.
that was the case here. This was somebody who'd had her poem rejected in 1965 for publication, but in such a nice way that she changed her will and never changed it back.
Incredible.
Nicole, would you like to speak, first introduce yourself and maybe speak a bit about your experience and with in particular reference to the think tank world, which you've had so much around gifts, giving, raising money?
Absolutely. So I'm Nicole Conchar. I know most of you in the room, but for those of you who don't know me, my very first job was at the Cato Institute many years ago, and I've had a very interesting career. I worked with a number of think tanks, ended up moving to New York and working with the Manhattan Institute and in the school choice movement. And then I met a really nice Zimbabwean and decided to get married and move to London and start over again. And again, worked in the small think tank community, took some time out, came back to work, and decided, gosh, I can't really do fundraising again. And then here I am. And 6 years later, I'm running my own company called Apple Fundraising Consultants. We're not trying to steal the Apple brand. It's a throwback to my time in New York. But it is a really interesting place to sit because I've been in-house. I've been a think tank fundraiser for many years. But I also have the distance because I'm a consultant. So I'm not in-house with every day with our clients. What we do is we have an interesting business model. We bolt together with nonprofits. We help them raise large quantities of money, and then we leave. So we have targets and goals. So we're not the people you stay around every day. And I think that's the first thing I want to mention quickly, is that when you're thinking of fundraising, there are 3 platforms. One is the endowment that Graham mentioned. That is the part that your legacy gifts. It's something to think about. It's one of those things you think, oh, maybe next year we'll start thinking about legacy gifts. But if you don't do it now, you're not going to reap those benefits in 20 years. So it's a really important fundraising platform that I think generally most Europeans just don't think about compared to Americans. I'm sure Cato is very much on their game on that one. The second platform is revenue fundraising. This is, I call the light bulb platform. This is what you have to do to keep the light bulbs on, the day-to-day. These are Graham's membership programs. This is what you need to do to just pay your staff. Obviously, extremely important, and this is what I used to do at Cato. And really what I do now is capital campaigns. These are, it's a separate type of fundraising. It's a different methodology. We're not running gala dinners. We're not doing membership programs, but we are looking for very high-end gifts in the shortest amount of time from the least amount of people as quick as possible. And that's what we do. And it could be bricks and mortar. We worked with Adam Smith's house in Scotland, trying to save his house, and I hope you all go visit next year. Yes, it's opening. And Mark Skousen very generously donated a first edition Wealth of Nations to the house, which is terrific. But we were brought in by the Edinburgh Business School to raise the funds to help resave this house, which is great. We've also worked with CERGE, we've worked with Barbara, but again, on very specific projects. But I think it's important to understand that these platforms use different methodologies. Capital campaign fundraising is very much peer-to-peer asking, getting a group of high net worth individuals who already believe in your organization and asking them to help you find other donors to do it. And that's what we do. We're very much, people also think when you hire a fundraising consultant, money's just going to appear from the ceiling, or we're going to fly to New York and get 2 empty suitcases and fly back. But it's not like that at all. It's still a lot of hard work. One other thing I wanted to mention that we were talking about the different types of tax incentives is the 501c3. And we know we have a lot of experience in this. And as a European, you think, I fly to New York, they'll give us money, and then we fly back, and it was great. It's a little more complicated to that. And I want to explain too, I think 501c3s are good, but they're also not for everybody. As Susan has set one up before, which I think you can comment on this too, but there's a lot of work involved.
It's expensive, and a lot of administration.
Absolutely. And so say you say, I'm going to make American Friends of blah, blah, blah. You get it set up, you go through the expense, you find the tax attorney. One of the myths actually surrounding it is that it costs all this money in Europe. Like, it's going to cost $20,000, 20,000 euros. It's not. If you get a good attorney, it's about $3,000 to $5,000. So it's definitely feasible. The other thing you have to do once you get it is you have to keep it. So one thing to get it, they give you a 2-year kind of grace period. But after that period, you have to adhere to these IRS rules. And if you don't pass something what's called a public support test, you do you will lose your tax. There's no tax incentive for your donors anymore.
Right.
I think it's really important for European groups here, think tanks, to think about that before embarking on this project and then possibly losing their status a few years down the line. So that's my other comment. And my other comment, Graham, is on yours, but you're talking about a lot of people fishing in the same pool. And I'm sure many of us in the room from a think tank perspective have all looked on the Templeton Foundation website. We all see these giant grants, and we all think we're going to get them. It's a lot of work, obviously. We've won a few. They're definitely worth the effort. But I think it makes, if you're going to go for these grants, if you're going to go for U.S. fundraising, it's more important than ever that you can tell your story in 2 pages. We call it the case for support. Why do you need the money? Why do you need it now? What are you going to do with it? Are there any naming opportunities? If HSBC decides to become your biggest donor, what are you going to give them in return? And so many think tanks here never think that through. And I would say from a fundraising perspective, I'm shocked at how many groups can't tell their story. You really, if you cannot tell your story in 2 pages, not a giant book, but if you can't tell it in 2 pages, how are you going to expect the donor to actually read what you're trying to do? So it's a really good exercise when you go back to your home countries, your home groups, to think about why are we raising money and why do we need it now?
Can I just ask you, Nicole, about private philanthropy? I mean, there's this wonderful, long-standing culture of giving in America, which, is just not yet replicated in the UK, and I suspect not in a lot of Europe. I mean, do you find there's a very different culture to giving?
Really good question. My American fundraising friends always ask, boy, Nicole, you got a really hard job. But I would say, exactly, but I think this is our situation. I don't think it's as bad as people make it out to be. It's not as transparent. It takes a lot more meetings. We call it 6 touches. Whereas if you fly, if you're in New York, you're at the Cato Institute, you can usually turn a gift around a lot quicker. I would say here it's much more relationship building, it's cultivation, not a lot of easy wins. So you have to be willing to put in that elbow grease.
I'm not sure it's necessarily common. Simply here we had, this crowding out effect, from bigger government, for a longer period of time. But even in the communist countries, we had this tradition of giving in the communist years as well. For example, mountain climbing clubs and fishermen clubs and that sort of stuff. They were existing, pretty freely because the government cannot control everything. I would like to ask a question, Susan. Mm-hmm. Your categorization is just brilliant. And I think, the think tank community falls into the mission, whatever beneficiaries.
Right.
Yeah. So how you sell a mission? So that's the question,
Actually, I think Nicole is better placed to.
Nicole.
Yes.
How do you sell the mission? To corporates, or who is the audience?
You probably should differentiate between individuals and corporates. Yeah. So
that's a really good question.
The corporates, they would have an opportunity to contact a consultant or a lobby group in Paris or whatever, in Washington, and then have part of the job done through business to business relations. So it must be different, but corporates also sell the mission. Yeah.
Interesting. I'm in the UK. I find corporate fundraising dismal in the think tank world. There's absolutely no.
It's very hard.
Very hard.
Yeah.
Less than 1%.
Compared to how Graham was saying in arts, it's entirely different.
It's good.
Because it's often so there's such political drivers behind it, and often they don't want to be seen as being in line, at least in the UK, with the Tory party or now Brexit. Brexit's another big one. And, they're concerned about blowback on share price, frankly. So it is very difficult in the UK around corporate sponsorship. Individuals, that's completely different.
Very different. That's where you're going to find your people who believe in your mission, and they come as part of your 3 streams. Hopefully, they're coming to your gala dinners. They're coming to your sponsorship. They're getting your publications. You're building relationships.
Chris Demuth was doing these gala dinners,
They're really nice.
Connecting the entire Washington.
I think Cato has one coming up next month. Yep, in New York.
Okay.
And I also think, too, in the United Kingdom, because so many of the think tanks are tied to administration, unlike, Cato and Manhattan Institutes, where they have the same senior people, the same CEOs for a very long period of time, and they sustain themselves through a Republican or Democratic administration. In the UK, life can be very short. And when the think tank sort of felt like Center for Policy Studies, for example, was seen as Cameron's think tank. Well, Cameron's not around anymore. So these things in the UK don't seem to have the same sustainability think tanks as they do in the US.
One interesting comment, too, you talked about pipeline. And that is the Cato model is the pipeline. I'm looking to Dan. But, you know, it was so interesting. But I remember, here's the mail again. This is like, run to the mail. I used to always beat Ed Crane to the front desk so you can get the mail first. But we would open up the mail, and there would be a really interesting donor. I'm like, you know, I think this guy might own something called Whole Foods. And then you would go and you research them, and then that $50 guy might become a $100 guy, might become a $500 guy. But the point is they feel more invested, and then they come to events. They get to know your staff. They get to know you, and they want to be part of this. And I think very much in the think tank perspective, they have to feel like they're on the journey with you.
That's actually a very good point, being on the journey, because it's one thing to be there, you know, mission aligned. So it's right, are you a free marketeer? I support you, you are, right? But then it's also, they're going to feel alignment with your mission depending upon how you choose to deliver that. So earlier today, you heard my colleagues, you heard Seb and Keith talk about CapEx. They use that as a use case. And that's something that I worked with Nicole on. Nicole helped raise the money for it and was very key and strategic in it. And, you know, CapEx was the way we communicated a message from what frankly was a very stuffy old think tank. And this was completely brand new for them. Be careful what you wish for, by the way, too. Okay, but
I mean, from an arts perspective, I mean, I'm constantly surprised how, you know, we are very passionate about our own project, about our own mission, our own platform. But in selling to a sponsor, you have to get into their heads, and you have to say what, you know, why, how does this look like from their perspective? How can this help them fulfill what they want to achieve? And it's such a simple test, and so often that's where the person seeking funding falls down, in my experience, because they just think, well, we're doing something great, you know, you need to fund it.
On that same note, thank your donors.
Yes, that's a big one.
How many times have I seen that?
This last round of talk reminds me the funding model of the Institute of International Finance. You should be aware of. Mm-hmm. The Institute of International Finance, I know it, you know, from Charles Delara's time. I'm not sure whether Charles is still there, but their model was more membership fee-like. You know, it's not entirely membership fee, but it was more membership fee. So, do you see this in Britain happening or in Europe? Because in New Europe, I think, you know, only the Lithuanian Free Market Institute has similar model to the Institute of International Finance. So you don't know about whatever the Free Market Institute in Vilnius, but if, for example, in Poland and Bulgaria, you know, we are on the first place in the world, you know, for think tanks in terms of per capita. You know, in Lithuania they have one think tank, you know, and one chamber of commerce. So, and all the businesses are sort of subscribers, you know, to the mission of the Lithuanian Free Market Institute. Yeah, Timbro is something similar. Yeah.
I mean, I do think we're at the beginning of a journey, but I constantly think that in the digital age, fundraising is going to become more and more community-driven, and it's about your communicating with your core supporters, some of whom will be high net worth and serious donors, some will be small donors, but it's about maintaining that community and connecting with them and listening to them, actually. I personally find crowdsourcing much more invigorating to the arts sector than crowdfunding, because crowdsourcing is about providing the kind of content that your audiences want. And I actually, most of the arts events my organisations produce now have bubbled up from within the extended community of support.
Let's open for...
Maybe before we do that, if we could just jump on to the earned income model, and then we'll talk about that.
We haven't talked about the good news yet.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'll introduce this, and Graham has actually had extensive experience on, especially to make arts organizations more enterprising and commercial, and he's going to discuss his use cases. So the second fundraising model, of course, is earning. So earned income streams, it supports independence and sustainability. It's ring-fenced revenue-generating mission-related activities and programs. You can have a separate commercial entity and whose surplus entirely supports the parent, and Graham will go into detail about that. And you have corporate structured options that could possibly support a commercial exit. And I'll talk about asset securitization later, but why don't you have a chat about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most exciting potential area for growth is in earned income. And it's absolutely the most promising area for diversifying the sources of funding for the arts. And obviously the best way of doing that is to sell more tickets for live audiences, for events, get more people involved. And certainly the success of my first organization was based on building a large live audience prepared to buy tickets for big, large venues. I think there's an even more exciting story beyond that, which is treating your arts organization in a different way as a repository of ideas, know-how, connections, fantastic connections, and assets, building that asset base and using it to earn income from various activities. And this is what I'm particularly interested in doing. I'll give you a concrete example. With my last organization, I started a public art consultancy in a trading subsidiary, which is what Susan is responding to, and delivered a whole series of commercial contracts to do with the delivery of public art and public art products, culminating in a contract to build a real 2-ton sculpture on the River Thames as part of the celebrations around the Rugby World Cup in 2015. And this was a fantastic amplification of the brand and of the arts in general, but it was also, more importantly from this perspective, a commercial contract which resulted in enough profit, unrestricted profit, to pay one of the employees for an entire year. Just one contract. And arts organizations are not in a position often to benefit from taking the ideas they already have, the know-how they already have, and monetizing it. Another product I'm working on at the moment is a corporate training product, talking to some very big city companies about delivering arts-based training products. Again, a highly commercial product, but one that also amplifies the arts and tells a bigger story about the importance of the arts in wider society. In both of these cases, these are training subsidiary activities entered into as business contracts with a view to profit, but they can greatly assist in diversifying the funding base of the parent charity, if that's the structure you have.
Nicole, isn't there a UK case in this for a think tank? It's not Institute of Economics Research, it has a consulting arm? Which you can,
I think the ASI.
ASI, yeah, that's right. And they have a very large consulting arm using this model that supports them. And now they've spun it out, haven't they?
They've completely spun it out. They're separate, but I think they benefited from it originally.
Absolutely. So when I was talking about that, you could have a structure by which there could be a commercial exit, and that's what's happened. And it's created an endowment actually for that think tank. So that was very, very successful. I think that also leads a little bit onto, and sorry for banker talk, so asset securitization, right? Realizing value on your balance sheet. But it links back to what we were talking about earlier. And Barbara asked me, like, in the video interview, why is it so important to protect property rights? Well, it's really simple, so you can monetize it, right? So you may have, in some of your think tanks here, you may have a special index, right? You may have a special methodology of how you do something, and actually taking that and really putting that on your balance sheet as intellectual property gives you then the opportunity to license it. And I know of a number of examples, certainly in the United States. This is a charity called 0 to 10, and where they had a special methodology to help young children when they were in doctor surgeries and they were little from chaotic families from ending up in jail. And if they could get them from 0 to 4, between 0 and 4, they had incredible impact. And they brought in, it was run by great psychologists and psychiatrists and things, and they brought in a commercial business person, and she got that program going where they created a program, they saw it as intellectual property, they licensed it. I know the scale of things is much bigger in the United States, but they got a $200 million grant to run this. Now it's over 15 years, but in like 30 states in the United States because they organized it that way. So, you should begin to look at your intellectual property as intellectual property and realize it that way.
Let's open now for questions, whatever, ideas, comments. Yes, Peter.
For quite a while now. Thank you. And I've never been personally involved in fundraising, but also talking to other US and UK think tanks, it's my impression that you have many people in Britain and the US who are wealthy, who have let's say, liberal ideas and who are willing to donate to good initiatives. But then I'm Belgium, and I don't. I feel like in the Benelux, France, Germany, I'm not talking about Scandinavia or other places, this is very different. So despite the fact that you have a lot of wealthy people, and a lot of those wealthy people who hold relatively liberal ideas, it seems incredibly hard to raise funds from these people. And I generally don't have a clue why that is. I mean, there's a number of initiatives who have been successful, but like, for example, my own country, Belgium or the Netherlands, I mean, I think there's as many wealthy individuals as proportionally as in the UK or even the US, maybe a bit less. But still, you don't see, you don't see the product of that in think tanks or even broader in NGOs. And I've always wondered why that is. Maybe it's because there's not the same kind of culture of donating and charity that you have in the Anglo-Saxon world. I don't know, maybe that's one explanation, but yeah, I'd hear your thoughts about that.
I'll jump in first, if I may. I lived in Britain. I'm American. I'm also British. I lived in Britain for 33 years. I raised money. How I started doing this kind of thing and being involved in this sort of thing was raising money in the U.S. actually for foreign institutions. For my first one was American Friends, the Louvre, right? And what happens is that it's so common that the government underwrites these institutions. So especially when it comes into the art world, to education, all sorts of things. So there's an expectation that the government's taking care of it. Yeah, and another one, the Chelsea pensioners, right? It's the exact same sort of thing. Everybody thinks that, the government is taking care of, it's another organization I support, they're veterans, right? Well, the government's taking care of the veterans. Well, actually, they're not fully taking care of that. So you spend an awful lot of your time in the UK, too, telling people that that's not the case. In the United States, the giving culture, it's not that Americans are more generous, right? It's that we don't have the same social safety net that you've got in the UK and certainly on continental Europe, right? So this is how I feel. I think Americans think they help because they think there, but for the grace of God go I, right? Because, when there's not much of a social safety net, you can go bankrupt because of your medical bills, $16,000 worth of medical bills. That's the average bankruptcy in the United States, or was about 3 years ago. For medical bills, you could be on the streets very, very easily. So people think, right, they'll support organizations that are helping others, resolve those problems. And I feel it's a case of that there's so much state support that people just think it's all taken care of. I don't know if you feel the same.
I'm very passionate about the need to change the conversation. I mean, even the term fundraising probably conjures up immediately in most people's minds, a begging bowl approach. You give us some money, we'll do it, we'll come back next year for some more money. I want to change that conversation. I think we really, from an arts perspective, we need to incentivize enterprise in the arts. There's a huge amount of talent, there's a huge amount of enterprise which is just completely crushed and held back. Which is why, as Susan knows, I've been campaigning for some time for an arts investment fund, one which I think should be based on a limited profit or capped profit basis, but one which makes absolutely clear that investors get their money back with an uplift. And this is in order to foster and nurture the kind of arts enterprise that I know is out there, and which will be, at the moment has nowhere to go as a sensible source of investment. So I'm very passionate about unlocking this potential in the arts, and I think straight old-fashioned investment is the way to do it, albeit it will have to be what you might call patient capital.
Yes.
And it might be a mixture of tax incentives on the way out and profit on the way in and profit on the way out. But there are many devices we can use to facilitate that. But we need to create that space of enterprise so that we engineer the mindset in arts entrepreneurs, which enable them to go and make money from the things they can make money from.
It's the same in the think tank world as well. I mean, grant capital is very important. It's critical because grant capital, talk about, our sources of capital here, it's the riskiest capital of all because your investor has no expectation of return, right? But that's why earned income is very important. I mean, Nicole will tell you funders now are saying, right, I'm happy to give you money. What are you doing to earn it yourself as well so you can be more sustainable? But when you look at earning your own revenue, and we can use the example of the consulting firm, right, in London with, was it A? What's the London think tank that has the consulting arm? Was it A?
ASI.
ASI. I'm sorry, I keep forgetting that. ASI. Well, the earned revenue activity that you have, whether you have that in a separate entity, right? Let's say you do, that can actually attract commercial capital alongside grant capital. And you're seeing this now, we certainly see it in the United States, you're seeing it actually in the UK too. And what that does, it lowers the cost of your capital. If you have a viable activity that you think you can make a go of it, it can earn some revenue, but it's not 100% commercially viable. There are plenty of donors, and in foundations now we're beginning to do this too. And Shell Foundation was like the pioneer of it, that's Royal Dutch Shell, is that they say, okay, we'll come in alongside a commercial investor, and we may choose to do a returnable grant. I'm seeing a lot of that, right? They'll say, okay, we'll look at it as a loan. So you may say, if something's viable and it's hard for you to raise 100% donor money, you can go to your donor and say, right, I would like a loan, a returnable grant. Now what happens is it's not at commercial rates, right? And there's no call on your asset. It's not debt on your balance sheet. If you don't pay it off because they're going to give their money away anyway, they have no call on your assets. But it's a huge benefit for you because you're able to, if you need it, you're able to raise commercial capital at a much, it lowers your total cost of capital. You're able to raise commercial capital because you already have this grant funding, whether it is a returnable grant. Sometimes you can have them structured as returnable convertible, meaning if I raise commercial capital and I was a massive big success, you can say, okay, to the donor, if I make a lot of money and I'm a massive big success, I'll share that success with you. And then you have tons of ways to structure it, but they can become an equity stakeholder too. And all of these creative alternative structures, they're structures that are simply used in structured finance in the banking market, yeah. But you're seeing more and more of this, people actually looking to be creative, because if you are creative about this, it makes you sustainable. It makes you independent. But the great thing for the donor is he's recycling his capital. So in the case of a returnable grant, right, you're giving him his money back, maybe over a period of 5 years, 3 years, whatever it is. But this was money he had planned to give away, never to get back. But he's got more money now to give away to somebody else too. So from my perspective, from a free marketeer and a libertarian perspective, I think it's like the best of really all worlds. It's cheaper capital, but it enables us to be independent.
These are sort of facilitators factors facilitating fundraising. But there are factors which, mentioning the welfare state, but it's not the only factor. There are factors which basically impede the fundraising and distort the market for fundraising. Could you focus on these factors?
What factors are you?
Okay, partially the left. So the entire fundraising capacity, covering the costs of the civil society of Georgia, say in 2008, was about $2 million. Because of the Russian-Georgian war, the entire world started helping Georgians. So, and USAID came with $15 million, which is 7.5 times more than they needed. And the European Union came with a program of 46 million for 5 years. So they destroyed everything. So they destroyed entirely, the giving culture of the Georgian society. So I know very well, what were the problems with Paata. Because people were paying, a fee, to get trained in market economy, taxes, measuring economic freedom, you name it. And they had trained, for about 6-7 years, they have trained about 15,000, students from mostly youngsters, business chambers, whatever, guilds, from all over the place. And suddenly, comes the East-West Management Institute with 14-15 million grants, and everybody started waiting, for money, from there in order to and without contributing yourselves, for example, to Paata's and his colleagues' services, you basically don't have any interest of learning anything. So,
right.
And it was crazy,
I think this is why most innovation is in the small and medium enterprise sector, because they're hungry, they're prepared to be innovative, they're prepared to be creative, and I think as soon as you get enormous sums of money from whatever source, it begins to deaden that desire to do things in a better way.
It also I think, and additionally to your point, it spoils the market. So in the UK, actually, when you set up a charity, one of the tests for it is you can't spoil the market, which I think is actually a very good thing. So you're right, when there's great big NGO money coming in from the United States and USAID, for smaller institutions that were relying upon their supporters, maybe charging a below market fee for education or whatever, you guys get blown out of the water. Yeah, and it spoils it. So yeah, that's certainly a downside.
So it happens very often with the European Union transfers. They have these advertisement of the union programs. They basically do grants to media, do grants to whatever, think tanks and that sort of stuff, mostly think tanks on the left. You have strange, think tanks like bringing the kids of the village A to the European Union, I'm literally quoting, so there is a foundation of bringing the kids of District C in the European Union, from a country, whatever, be it Slovakia, Czech Republic, or Bulgaria. I think something of the sort is now happening with the so-called Western Balkans, ex-Yugoslavia and Albania. So you have, you have 7 billion euros, for different government programs, financed by the EU. Half of that is infrastructure. The other half is administration, social welfare, and you name it. So, and they will destroy, the entire fabric of the societies over there.
Yes.
I think they're doing okay. I'm working on the Balkans, for already 20 years. I know most of the people in the free market movement there. But, the European Union, if they start, and they are starting, I guess, to finance, the so-called civil society. So it's just an amazing destruction of the local culture.
And groups like USAID pull out. What do these groups do? Because they, for example,
USAID was one of the rational groups operating, not entirely, not that often, but time to time, they were rational. They pull out of New Europe a couple of years, 2 years before they were joining the European Union. But then the European Union came, and suddenly, for example, I remember the figures for Bulgaria, the entire, civil society support program of USAID was about 1 million for 2 years, or 500,000 a year. The European Union came, and it was already 2 million euro a year. So again, something happened, and probably about 80% of the civic sector, including the think tanks, become donor-driven, and everybody lined up, queuing, for European Union funding. So, and eventually they surrendered, or they had given up, their values. There were lots of free market or sort of charity-oriented organizations, but everybody suddenly lined up because it become huge. It's 4 times bigger than the funding available through USA.
Right.
One of the problems with Hungary, so part of the Orban's influence is the charity program or whatever of the funded by taxpayers of Hungary to finance the civil society. 1% of GDP, they voted a law. 1% of GDP goes as a subsidy to the civil sector, to the civil society, which basically destroys many things. And now this is one of the reasons, they dismiss, foreign universities, funding, and that sort of stuff. Sorry, Scott.
Well, I wonder if I could bring the conversation back to something more practical, and that is just getting the meeting. Both for prospective donors, but also for your own donors. For instance, I have people that we've been giving through us through direct mail for more than a decade, and I've never met them because I'll write them letters, I'll phone call and try to meet with them. Oh, no need for that. And how do you get the meeting? How do you, without being a pest or annoying or turning them off of your project? So first for the perspective, how do you get your foot in the door for people you think should be attracted to your project? And then secondly, for your own donors, how do you get to them when they kind of know, they don't want to get a personal ask, and all we're doing is trying to get to know them? It's a big challenge.
That's what I do.
How do you do it?
People call me the insistent voice. When they get an email from me like, oh, it's a friendly reminder, Nicole, like, yes, you have 5 things to do today. And no, I completely understand, because sometimes it can feel like it's painful. It's, you've crossed the line. But assuming you've done your research, this person has actually, it's really interesting. I made a little note earlier. We score our prospects. So we use a score of 4 different things. Backing up one step, I have clients that come to me like, Nicole, we feel like I've got this great list. It's the Sunday Times rich list. Oh, everyone. And if I hear Richard Branson one more time, he cuts across everything, even the think tank world. And I ask 4 questions, and this is what we go down to. Capacity. Well, 1, do they have the money? And do they actually have the money to make this gift? Number 2, do they have the propensity? Is there any track record? Have they ever given to any other think tanks before? Is there anything there? Number 3, is there any interest? Is there any interest in the project you have? So again, maybe that's a lower score for you on that one. And number 4, the most important thing, and which is why the Sunday Times Rich List never works, is can you get a meeting with Richard Branson? Do you have the access? Do you know his PA's phone number? Because if you don't, Richard Branson's in the trash can. And then when we sit down and rethink it out, and we look at capacity, propensity, the interest and the access, then you score, and that's how you use your time. The people who get the top scores, that's the ones you should go after, or continue. If they say no the first time, well, no worries, I'm coming to Texas next year, let's talk again. And that's how we do it. I was at the University of St. Andrews. We did a project there for their 600th anniversary, and we scored every single name in their entire alumni network. But it really helped them structure their time, because when you have a staff of 4 people and 2 consultants on the side, and you've got to raise £100 million for your 600th anniversary, you've got to use your time the best. So I think my advice to you would be, 1, don't give up, right. And 2, and make sure you use your time really well. So
the first step is really just building the relationship rather than just going in for the ask.
Yeah,
And that's often the hardest
absolutely,
thing.
Absolutely.
I was going to say, actually, this is the human factor, and Nicole is very good at this. I mean, because she's so charming and so energetic. That, you know, who wouldn't want to give her money? But that's really important.
Well, I must not be.
But I think people forget the human factor because they're so focused on, you know, on getting the deal on sponsorship. They forget they're dealing with a human being with their own interests and their own, you know. And, you know, if you're going to engage them, it might be something really small. It might be remembering, you know, their kid's birthday, or, you know, doing something, a little thoughtful thing, which doesn't actually cost you anything at all. I mean, I can remember an incident with a VIP well, a bunch of people kind of gathered like a wolf pack who wanted to send on this VIP, who just wanted to go and get some money from a cash point and I said, well, I'll come with you to the cash point. And that's what she wanted. She wanted somebody, and by the time she came back from a cash point, she was supporting my arts organisation. So you know, it's about the human factor and being, you know, open to what their needs are as individuals, I think.
We have 5 minutes for last interventions. Yes, we had over there. Somebody else? Or is this? Oh, we have 2. Let's collect all of them.
Cheers, thank you. The last refuge of the scoundrel, it seems to me on Twitter, you get into an argument with someone and they'll go, well, who funds you? At least you know then you've almost always won the kind of political argument, if that's what they kind of resort to. And of course, a lot of lefty groups are quite proud that they rinse taxpayers by getting kind of public grants and government grants to fund their various research and stuff. Is that just going to always be a factor for libertarian groups that we're going to have to put up with that because we respect donor privacy? Because if you've seen what kind of momentum in the UK and various other groups around will probably try and do to some of those donors if they find out who they are, it will be quite unpleasant. Is that just a kind of a facet of this? Does that affect how much people are willing to get involved with various organisations, or is there a way to change that?
And could you pass the mic to a person over here?
I know. Should we answer that and then go to the next?
No, let's
okay, do both.
Okay. Yes, sure.
So mine's not really a question. It is more of a follow-up. So my name is Mike Rose. I'm here representing Comcast NBC Universal. So somebody asked the question, how do you get in with corporate donors? That's my job. So I work with think tanks throughout the United States. So we're a domestic company, but we've shown some interest in acquiring Sky. So I wanted to come here and get a sense of the international, the European think tank space. So somebody asked the question, how do you get in with corporate entities? How do corporations support think tanks? Well, for me, it's simple. Basically, it's relationship-based. And 2, develop that relationship. And then 2, show how the work that you are doing and the work that you have done helps the company's interests. So we're a heavily regulated industry. And the work primarily on the center-right and libertarian organizations is generally keep the government off of corporations' backs, keep the government off industry's back, keep taxes low. That's what we care about. So if you can show a company like Comcast or AT&T or any number of companies that the work you're doing is helping their interests, they're inclined to help you out.
Thank you.
Susan. Well, actually, I think, Nicole, you should ask about, because you have raised money for these type of institutions, and about donor confidentiality and how that affects.
I have a client right now that's been in the line of fire quite a bit. It's a tough place to sit. Mm-hmm. I think transparency is probably, the more transparent you are comfortable with, it just diffuses the debate in my experience. This client has not handled their bad press well, and they're rethinking it. So I also have another client who feels very, very strongly about everything is secret. So it's a tough question, actually. Thanks, Susan.
Well, I think it was for the same institution, one of them that you're talking about. And you know that we have our Teaching Fellows program, the Free Market Missionaries. That is the donor prefers not to be known, and he funds that entirely himself, and he wants to keep it that way, and we respect it. And it comes from an intermediary foundation, and that's okay. But you're right, somebody finds out that the Koch brothers fund you, other people bail.
Okay.
Reputational issues in the arts are very strong. I mean, some people have got badly burnt because of protests. They're taking money from BP or whatever, and suddenly you've got a sort of protesters pouring oil over themselves in the middle of your exhibition. I mean, I've always had a very robust attitude in the sense that I think, the arts purifies whiter than white any money that's given to it. So for me, the real question is process. Is the money influencing the outcome or not? If it's influenced the outcome, well, your Twitter complaint may have some justification. But if it's merely keeping the show on the road, I mean, I'd be as robust as you like about it.
Good point.
Before passing the panel to Barbara and the next panelist, allow me to thank you. It was a great conversation. I think it was useful. So, thank you.